Welcome to Life Stories. Today, we bring you a heartbreaking tale of loss, mystery, and the pursuit of justice. For 27 years, a mother, Sarah Montgomery, has lived with the unanswered question of what happened to her daughter, Olivia, and the rest of her class during a school trip. With the discovery of a crucial detail, everything changes. Follow Sarah's journey as she uncovers the truth. A truth so painful it shatters everything she thought she knew. Join us as we dive into this emotional story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start the journey today. It was a cold, gray morning in early autumn, and I could feel the weight of the years pressing down on me as I woke up that day. It had been 27 years since Olivia, my little girl, vanished without a trace during a school trip. The day had arrived again, that agonizing anniversary. And despite the years that had passed, the grief still felt fresh, as though it had been only yesterday that I last saw her smile. I woke slowly, trying to gather the strength to face the day. My bedroom was still, save for the sound of the wind rustling the trees outside. I stared out the window at the overcast sky. The clouds were thick, almost oppressive, mirroring the heaviness in my heart. As I lay there, a quiet ache in my chest reminded me of the endless ache of not knowing. There had never been a body to bury, just an empty grave marked with her name, Olivia Montgomery. Beloved daughter. It had been our only means of coping with the loss, giving her a place we could visit, a tangible connection to her memory. But it was never enough. I would never see her again. I rose from the bed, my hands trembling slightly as I reached for a framed photograph that hung on the wall next to my mirror. It was a picture of Olivia from her school days, just a few weeks before she disappeared. In her school uniform, her face glowing with happiness, her smile wide. I had seen that smile 1,000 times. But today, it tore at my heart. Oh, how I missed her. I whispered her name softly, as if somehow the sound could bridge the gap between now and then. Between this empty room and the warmth of the past. Olivia, I murmured, my voice faltering, catching on the memories. It had been years, yet the pain felt as raw as it had been that morning when I woke up to the news that her entire class had disappeared. A school trip, just a normal trip for the children. And yet, it turned into a nightmare that we, as parents, would never wake from. My hands lingered on the photo for a moment longer. Then I took a steadying breath and forced myself to let go. The grief had been my constant companion. But so was the need to keep going. To honor her memory, I had to get through this day, just like every year before. I had to be strong, even if it felt like every fiber of my being was crumbling. I went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and dressed quickly, my movements automatic. But when I checked my phone, I saw a message from Rebecca, one of the other mothers who had lost her child that day. Rebecca was the only one who truly understood my pain. She had lost Sally, her only daughter, in the same tragedy. Over the years, she had become my closest friend. Someone who held the same heartache as I did. Someone who, like me, had never given up hope of finding out what had happened. The message was simple, a reminder that I wasn't alone. You're not alone today. If you need company, I'm here, always. I felt a small comfort knowing that Rebecca, despite her own pain, was there for me. I sent her a quick reply. Thanks. I'll come over. There was something soothing about being around people who shared the same grief. Even if that grief was never truly spoken, it was understood, present in every glance, in every quiet moment. I gathered my things, a jar of homemade lavender cookies, and some tea for us to share, and walked the familiar path to Rebecca's house. The neighborhood had not changed much over the years. The houses looked the same, their roofs still lined with that same faded blue paint, their windows framed with white curtains. It was as though time had stood still for everything except us, the parents who had lost so much. As I approached her front door, I saw Rebecca standing in the doorway, her eyes immediately meeting mine. She opened her arms and embraced me, holding me close. I know today is hard, she whispered, her voice soft, but filled with understanding. She didn't need to say anything more. We moved inside together, and the warmth of her house, The smell of freshly brewed tea brought me a sense of comfort that I hadn't expected. Rebecca and I had spent so many mornings like this, sipping tea, sitting in silence, and sharing stories of our children, memories that, though painful, kept them alive in our hearts. As she made the tea, I settled onto the couch, trying to steady my thoughts. We both knew what today meant. We both knew how hard it would be to go through another year without knowing the truth. "How are you holding up?" Rebecca asked gently, sitting down beside me with the tea. Her eyes were soft, but there was a depth to her gaze that told me she understood how much this day hurt. I sighed deeply, my eyes downcast. "I'm trying to keep it together," I said quietly, feeling the weight of the years pressing in. "But every year, this day is the hardest." Rebecca nodded, the same grief in her eyes that mirrored my own. "I know, Sarah, I know. I think I'll always feel it. This emptiness inside. I've tried to accept it, to move on, but it never really goes away. Does it?" "No," I whispered, feeling the tears well up again. "It never does." We sipped our tea, our hands wrapped around the warm mugs. And for a moment, I felt a little lighter. In the quiet, there was a comfort, a sense that we were sharing this burden together. But deep inside, I knew that there was still so much left unanswered. So much we had never been told. Every year, we clung to the hope that one day the truth would come out. But every year, it didn't. Every year, it felt as if the answer was slipping farther and farther away. But today, something had shifted. I could feel it in the air. Something was different, and I couldn't quite place my finger on it. Maybe it was the photograph I had found earlier. The one I'd kept hidden away for years. The one that seemed to hold the key to everything. But I had no idea then how that photograph would change everything. And how, after all these years, the truth would finally be revealed. As Rebecca and I continued sipping our tea, the conversation naturally drifted into the past. We talked about our children, the joy they had brought us, the laughter that had filled our homes. But eventually, our discussion turned to the haunting mystery that still loomed over us. What had really happened during that school trip? The years had dulled some of the sharpness of the pain. But the questions, the doubts, still gnawed at me. No one had ever truly answered what had happened that day. We were told that the teacher, Mr. Gregory, had been the one to accompany the children, and a support staff member had been with him. But deep down, I had always wondered if that was the whole truth. It didn't sit right with me. Suddenly, in the midst of our conversation, I remembered something, a detail that had been buried deep in my mind for years. It had come to me as I sat in the quiet of Rebecca's living room, flipping through a photo album she had kept. It was a photo of the school trip, one that I had never seen before. Olivia, Sally, and the other children were all smiling in the photo. Some of them gathered around the science project they had been working on before the trip. It was a snapshot of innocence, of childhood before the horror descended. And there, standing among the children, was Principal Jennifer Blake. It was a detail I had never noticed before. But once I saw it, everything about the story began to shift. Why was the principal in that photo? I had always been told that she stayed behind at the school, that she had nothing to do with the trip. But here she was, smiling alongside the children and the teacher. My heart began to race, and a flood of emotions washed over me. Could this be the clue we had been searching for all these years? "Rebecca," I said, my voice trembling, "look at this. Do you see what I see?" She took the photo album from me, her eyes scanning the page. At first, she didn't notice anything out of the ordinary. But then her gaze paused on the same figure I had seen, the principal. "Wait, why is Principal Blake in this picture?" Rebecca's voice faltered, a mix of confusion and concern crossing her face. "I thought Mr. Gregory went alone with the children. He was the only adult with them, wasn't he?" I nodded, feeling the tightness in my chest. "That's what they told us. But look at her, she's right there, in front of the school bus with the children. Why didn't anyone ever mention this before?" Rebecca looked back at the photo, her expression becoming more thoughtful. "I don't know. I remember hearing rumors that Principal Blake had been there. But I didn't think much of it. I thought it was just gossip. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were onto something big. But why didn't anyone confirm this? Why didn't they tell us the truth? Rebecca shook her head, her face pale. I don't know. But, Sarah, we've been down this road before. Haven't we? Remember the time we thought we'd found a clue about the bus driver? We've been down this road before, thinking we found something important, only to have it lead to nowhere. Her words hit me hard, and I felt a pang of doubt. It was true, over the years. I had gotten my hopes up more times than I cared to admit. I had convinced myself that I'd found answers only to have them slip through my fingers. But something in me refused to let go. Something about this felt different. I stared at the photo once more. The face of Principal Blake staring back at me. Her presence in that photo creating more questions than answers. I didn't know what to make of it. But I knew I couldn't ignore it. This had to mean something. I know it seems like I'm chasing shadows, Rebecca, I said quietly, but I have to know the truth. I can't live with these doubts anymore. We've suffered enough, and I know you feel it too. But I think this photo, might be the key. Rebecca hesitated, her eyes softening with understanding. I know, Sarah, I do. But we've been down this road before. You don't want to get your hopes up again. I can't help it, I whispered. I just can't let go. Not this time. We sat in silence for a moment. The weight of our grief and longing hanging heavy in the air. My fingers still traced the edges of the photograph, unwilling to let go of the hope it ignited. The truth was just out of reach. But I couldn't stop now. Not when the pieces were finally starting to fall into place. It wasn't long after I left Rebecca's house that something unexpected happened, something that would change everything. I had no idea that, by the end of the day, the answers I had been searching for so many years, would finally begin to unravel. But it started in the most unexpected place, at the cemetery. Every year, like clockwork, I visited Olivia's grave. It was my way of marking the anniversary, of connecting with the memory of my daughter, whose absence still left a painful hole in my heart. Today, though, as I stood in front of her tombstone, surrounded by rows of other children who had vanished on that fateful day, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted. The air felt different. The weight of grief and loss hung thick in the air. But so did something else, a sense of anticipation. I glanced around, as I always did, and then I saw her. At first, I thought it was just someone visiting one of the other graves. But as I walked closer, I realized that it was the woman, the one I had seen earlier that day. In Principal Blake's house. Her name was Emily Parker. She was standing near the graves of the other children, her back to me, her shoulders shaking with quiet sobs. Something about her seemed so familiar, but I couldn't place it. As I got closer, I saw that she was holding something in her hands. A framed photo, and she was gazing down at it with such intensity. It almost felt as if the rest of the world had faded away for her. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my heart racing. I wasn't sure why, but something deep inside urged me to approach. I called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "Excuse me?" She turned quickly, her expression changing from sadness to surprise. The moment her eyes met mine, a flicker of recognition passed between us. Her face went pale, and she wiped her eyes quickly, as though trying to erase any sign of vulnerability. "Oh, it's you," she said in a voice barely above a whisper, her words tinged with both fear and sadness. I felt a knot tighten in my stomach, a sense of urgency flooding through me. "You?" I hesitated for a moment, my voice trembling with a mix of emotions. "You were at Principal Blake's house earlier today, weren't you?" Emily stiffened, looking around nervously, as if trying to decide whether to run or stay. Her eyes darted toward the other side of the cemetery, where the other families were gathered. Then, after a long pause, she nodded, though her expression was guarded, as if she was unsure of what to say. "Yes, I was," she whispered, "but I didn't expect anyone to recognize me." "Why are you here?" I asked softly. Are you connected to what happened to my daughter? To the others? To the disappearance?" For a moment, Emily didn't respond. Instead, she looked down at the photograph in her hands, her fingers tightening around the edges. Her lips trembled as though she wanted to speak but couldn't. Finally, she spoke, her voice fragile. "I didn't want to be found," she said. "I didn't want anyone to know the truth about what happened that day." She swallowed hard, her gaze shifting nervously toward the families gathering at the other end of the cemetery. "But the truth, it's time to tell the truth." Her words sent a shock through me. My heart was racing now, as I struggled to process what she was saying. "You know something. You were there, weren't you?" Emily looked back at me, her eyes full of pain. "Yes, I was there. I was one of the children who disappeared that day. I was one of the missing." The words hit me like a tidal wave, crashing over me with an intensity I hadn't prepared for. For all these years, I had believed that the children had been taken, that they were gone without a trace. But now, here she was, a survivor. And somehow, she had lived to tell the story. I took a step forward, my voice trembling with disbelief. "But why? Why didn't you come back home? Why didn't anyone know you were alive?" Emily closed her eyes, as though the question caused her physical pain. "I couldn't face my family," she whispered. "I was too broken. After everything that happened, I couldn't go back to them. It felt safer to stay hidden." I felt a deep ache in my chest. I understood, in some small part, how she must have felt, trapped in a prison of grief and fear. But there was so much more. She had survived. She had made it out when so many others hadn't. And yet, she had lived in silence for all these years. "Emily," I said softly, my voice full of compassion. "You don't have to be afraid anymore. Please, tell me what happened. Tell me what happened to Olivia and the others." Her gaze softened at the mention of my daughter's name. "I wish I could give you more answers," she said, "but I'm not sure where to start." "Anywhere," I urged her. "Please, I need to know." And so, she began to speak. What she told me would shatter everything I thought I knew about that day, and about Principal Blake. But, at that moment, all I could do was listen, desperate to understand what had really happened to the children, to Olivia, and to so many others who had been lost. As Emily began to speak, the world around me seemed to blur. Her voice, though soft and trembling, carried a weight that sent chills down my spine. The story she told was one I had never imagined, and yet it made perfect sense in its horrifying way. Everything I thought I knew, everything we had all been told about that day, was a lie. "I was one of the children taken," Emily began, her voice raw with emotion. "But I wasn't the only one. We were all taken, each of us. The teachers, they didn't know what was happening. They didn't know what Principal Blake was involved in." Her hands shook as she held the framed photo tightly, her eyes fixed on the image as if she could pull some comfort from it. "Principal Blake?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. She was involved?" Emily nodded slowly, a look of profound sadness in her eyes. "Yes," she said quietly. "She wasn't just a bystander. She orchestrated it all. The trip, the kidnapping, everything. The teacher, Mr. Gregory, was just a pawn. She had debts, Sarah, serious ones. Dangerous people were after her. People who had no mercy." I could feel my heart beating faster, the horror of her words settling deep in my gut. "What do you mean debts?" I asked, though I already had a sinking feeling I knew the answer. Emily's face tightened. She owed money to people who weren't just going to let her off the hook. They were loan sharks, dangerous men who would have killed her family if she didn't pay. So, she made a deal. She planned the trip to Big Bend Park. But it wasn't about the park. It was a ruse. The moment we left the school, it wasn't about seeing the sights. It was about getting us somewhere we could be sold. I gasped, my mind struggling to keep up with what she was saying. "Sold? What do you mean sold?" Emily's face fell, her voice barely above a whisper as she continued. "We were taken across the border. To Mexico. Some of us were sold for child labor. Others, for something worse. The girls, like me, we were trafficked. They sold us to the highest bidder. I was one of the lucky ones. I managed to escape after a few years. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. Olivia, my sweet, innocent daughter. She was one of those children. The idea that she had been taken, forced into something so horrific, nearly broke me in that moment. My mind swirled with images I couldn't bear. And yet I couldn't tear my thoughts away from the painful truth Emily had revealed. Olivia, I choked out, my voice breaking. What happened to Olivia? What happened to my daughter? Emily's eyes softened, and she hesitated before answering. I didn't see her for long. But I remember, she didn't make it. She died that day. Sarah, they gave her an overdose of something. Some drug to keep us quiet. She didn't survive the first night. Tears welled up in my eyes as the weight of those words crushed me. I had always hoped, even after all these years, that Olivia was out there somewhere, alive, but now, I knew what had happened to her, and it shattered me in a way I hadn't prepared for. Emily continued, her voice trembling as she spoke. I'm sorry, Sarah, I'm so sorry, I couldn't tell you sooner. It hurt too much, and I was scared, but now I can't keep it in anymore. We all need to know the truth. I wiped my tears, feeling the unbearable grief rise up inside me. But I forced myself to focus on what she was saying. Emily, you're telling me the truth now. And that's all I've ever wanted. But what about Principal Blake? What about her? Why did she let this happen? Emily's eyes darkened. She didn't just let it happen. Sarah, she made it happen. She took the money, made the arrangements. She knew what was happening. And she didn't care. Her only concern was saving herself. The children? We were just a means to an end. My hands clenched into fists as a surge of anger rose within me. And now she's walking free. She's lived her life while our children were taken from us. Emily nodded, her voice firm now. No, Sarah, she won't get away with it. Not this time. You have the truth now. You have the proof. We need to take it to the police. We need to bring Principal Blake to justice. The resolve in her voice was strong. And I felt a renewed sense of purpose stirring inside me. For 27 years, I had wondered what happened to my daughter. But now, with Emily's words, I knew, and I would do whatever it took to see justice done, not just for Olivia, but for every child who had been taken. We stood together, in that cemetery filled with memories. And in that moment, I knew one thing for sure. The fight was just beginning. As Emily and I stood in the cemetery, a quiet resolve began to settle over me. For 27 long years, I had lived in a world of uncertainty, haunted by questions that seemed to have no answers. But now, the truth was clear, painful, and undeniable. Principal Blake had orchestrated the tragedy that had shattered so many lives. And it was time to bring her to justice. We went to the police. And with Emily's testimony, the case was reopened. The investigation took on a new urgency. And soon, the horrifying details of the trafficking ring were uncovered. Principal Blake was arrested, and the truth about what happened to the children began to unfold. It was a bittersweet victory. The knowledge of what had really happened to Olivia and the others would never bring them back. But at least it gave us closure. The families who had suffered for so long now had something they had been denied for decades, the truth. Emily, now in witness protection, began a new life, far away from the shadows of her past. Though the scars would never fully heal, she found peace in knowing that her voice had made a difference. As for me, I could finally lay my grief to rest. I still visited Olivia's grave every year. But now, I didn't go with only sorrow. I went with a sense of purpose. A sense that justice had been served. And that the memory of the children would never be forgotten. Thank you for following this story. If you want to hear more true life tales and follow along on this journey, don't forget to subscribe to Life Stories. Your support means the world to us.